Hey there, I'm Scott, and this is Tangents. Well, once again, it's Friday night when I'm recording this. Well, night, 15:45. Not quite night. End of the day though. Kind of finding that I'm getting my stuff backed up to the point where that's about the only time I have to really record. I've had, obviously like could do it a weeknight or, some other, like an actual night. But try to not fuck with my sleep too much more than it's already fucked with. So I try not to record one of these at like 10 or 11. And I have certain things that I like to do that are times where I can't do one of these, like walk around or eat. Can't do this while I'm walking or eating. I guess I could do one while I was walking, but I'd look like a crazy person talking to myself. Not that I don't look like a crazy person talking to myself here, but nobody's here but me. So, anyway, recording it Friday. Not gonna get backed up and double up on recordings again, or at least that's not my intention. So I'm gonna put this out in the next couple of days. You'll obviously see it after that, probably not before, unless you're, achronal. Anyway, I think today what I want to talk about a little bit is takes, and in particular, and I talk a lot about this, just Dunning-Kruger and sort of the, I hate to use death of expertise because Tom Nichols is a giant fucking asshole, and unfortunately he came out with the book, but the idea, or part of the idea of that, is not, untrue. I mean, there's just this pretty big problem that we have where people first off just kind of think their opinion is as meaningful as anyone else's opinion. um, I can have an opinion about finance, but if somebody who is actually like trained as a quant and has a PhD in economics probably knows more about finance and economics than I do, not necessarily, but one would guess. Um, I'm just pretty much sputtering off about nothing sometimes there. I mean, it's not to say that I haven't done some independent education and training and understanding of that, but there is a lot of stuff obviously that I'm not an expert in. But people today seem very convinced, A, of their own expertise, B, of the meaninglessness of actual expertise, and C, that their opinion about things is as meaningful, as important, as significant as that of somebody who has spent their life studying something. And I find this really fucking annoying, honestly. The thing that prompted this is on Twitter, somebody was asking about vaccines and viral load. And in particular, he was asking, why is it that people who are vaccinated can have viral loads that are as high as people who are unvaccinated? Does that mean that the vaccine's not working? No, it doesn't. And I answered the question, and I always feel compelled to point out, I have a master's in microbiology with emphasis in virology and immunology. I know a little bit about the subject. It's basically all the coursework I would have had for a PhD in the subject. And so I answered him, and there are several reasons, but the big reason here is not that the antibodies the vaccine is eliciting are not working, but your cells can still get infected unless you're like filled with antibodies, which you probably aren't. But two things are happening. One, if you have antibodies in your system, they're going to inactivate those virions, the virus particles that are getting secreted. So you might still have a high viral load, but you're not going to necessarily be as able to infect other cells within you. And two, after you get inoculated the first time and then the second time, you elicit a B cell response. B cells are the cells that make antibodies. And the first one, you're just kind of selecting for a B cell that is pretty close to what you need. You're kind of like getting it to expand, getting it angry. The second time, you're getting the progeny of that cell to sort of expand even more and really have this amplified response, which means first off, they're able to secrete antibodies, and that is already kind of priming you to be a little bit more resistant. But also, and quite significantly, if you get infected, they're there, and the progeny of that cell are there, ready to fight. As soon as you get infected, they start expanding, and then you get a shit ton of antibodies. Those continue to be released, and then they prevent the virus from expanding more. Both of these factors mean that you can have very high viral loads, shed a lot of virus, and still have protective immunity. It's not like protective immunity is just magical that keeps you from getting infected. If a virus comes in, hits a cell that's not like shielded in any way, you're gonna get infected probably. So this was a thing that I said, and I probably said it a little bit more tersely and in abstract language, but in a way that the guy who asked the question said, yeah, thank you. I had the pieces, but I didn't quite fit it all together, and now I do. Then someone who, and I'm not condoning this person at all, not saying anything negative about the person. I like them actually, but came in and kind of said, yeah, this is my take. This is what I agree with this. And yeah, that's great. And I appreciate that you agree with me, but also, it's not my take. It's not like this is just my sort of interpretation of what's happening. It's basically, like kind of, and again, obviously, everybody can be wrong about stuff, even experts, absolutely true. Being an expert does not make you a priest. It doesn't make you infallible, any of this kind of stuff. But, this is something which, it's not like a matter of right or wrong. It's just kind of, I don't even know how to say it. It's just like, yeah, that's great that it's your take, but it's actually relatively correct here. And I'm trying not to be like overly disparaging, and I'm certainly not going to, shit on this person who said this, other than, on here, which is, probably an expanded audience relative to Twitter. Not that I have a huge audience here, but, not directly confrontational. Maybe it's just a passive-aggressive way of doing it. I don't know. But whatever it is, I'm not speaking specifically to or about that person. I'm just talking about this very general thing where people have, take is, the reason I'm calling this take is just, they're takes. They're like a response to something. First off, they're not things that are unelicited, which is an interesting thing. They're kind of, some kind of external stimulus triggers a response. Everything, kind of comes from something, I guess, but it's sort of a reactive rather than proactive approach to things, but it's also sort of the nature of modern social media. Just people are not generating things de novo, they're kind of reacting to things and swarming around things and this kind of thing. I don't think that's that great. There's nothing necessarily wrong with it, but I think being dominated by that is not a great thing. But more importantly, and again, the reason that I'm talking about this, there are differences of opinion where it's just a matter of opinion. And then there are differences of opinion where one opinion is much more right than other opinions. And I'm not even necessarily specifically talking about this or things that I encounter personally all the time, although you do run into people who have no expertise in stuff, no training, no understanding of certain things, and they come out with their kind of knee-jerk reaction to stuff based on a very superficial understanding. And even if it's right, and sometimes it is right, it's not like every time you come up with a random ad hoc take, it's not always wrong. But even when it's right, it's not right in a justified way, which means that if it happens to be right, it's not like it had any reason to expect that it was right. It's not like it had anything backing it that, ensured that it would be right. It's just kind of a random ass plucking something out of the air and you happen to get something. And this is not a way to run an epistemology. This is not a way to run a society or a civilization. I mean, it's like people talk about it's frustrating as hell because, and I talk about this specifically with vaccines here because I run into this shit all the time, but it's pretty much ubiquitous. Vaccines are annoying as fuck because people with no understanding of stuff come up with just crazy bullshit. And yeah, half the time I don't even want to sort of delve in because they're so wrong. Sometimes, there's a thing about string theory, not even wrong. Sometimes people are so off base in what they say that it's almost not even wrong. And by that, I don't mean that they're right. I just mean that, it's like almost orthogonal to anything that makes any sense. And they'll say shit that's like, you're so far from something that is coherent or a good understanding of something that it would actually take, days to try to shepherd you back to something that's real. And certainly, you don't actually get days to talk to this person. You instead, Twitter is the social media poison that I'm mostly partaking of. But on Twitter, you go back and forth, and you try to explain something to somebody, and they come back with their own fucking bullshit, often that has no connection to reality, and then you're like, I can't even, like, what the fuck do I do with this? And you can spend a long time going back and forth with people. You can try to be very civil. But there is at a certain point a thing where it's like, yeah, you have a difference of opinion. That's fine. But this is not a subjective thing. This is not something where your opinion means anything. And not only that, but your opinion, I don't know how to disparage it adequately. Like, there are certain things where you can have things, you have judgment based on taste. I happen to like this, you happen to like that. Who's to say who's right or wrong? That's subjective. Reality is not subjective. Reality is sort of intrinsic. It is external to us, and it's something where, and now, of course, you could take the bizarre philosophical stance that, well, what if we're just brains in a jar and all of this is imaginary and none of this is real? It's like, okay, yeah. The parsimonious explanation is not that. You can always add epicycles to things to make some kind of complex explanation for anything, pretty much, if you want to. But assuming that this is what it appears to be, assuming that all of the time that I've spent studying certain things is actually real, and I'm pretty confident that it is, there are certain things where people talk about them and you're just like, why are you even... It's like somebody saying that fire is endothermic. And then you're sitting there like, first off, I don't know how you get something that's that insane that you're saying. Second, I don't even know where to begin with trying to correct this. And you go back and forth with people who say something just ridiculous like that, and I don't even, at a certain point, even if you convince them or even if you get somewhere, it's almost like it was just a Pyrrhic victory and pointless because you're like, okay, what? I've wasted so much fucking time. I feel dumber. We are all dumber for having heard it. It's just like, this discussion is just pointless. I don't know how you can fix this. I mean, I've talked with a lot of people about this recently, and one of the big, before the internet came, people thought about hypertext and the internet and all this kind of stuff. And they're like, well, what if we had this magical repository of all human knowledge and everything is interconnected and accessible to everyone? And you think about it in this utopian fashion without really considering, well, if you have that and anyone can put anything out there that they want, you have the actual, grounded reality, but you have just a proliferation of alternate realities which are disconnected from anything that people put out there, and it's just as easy for them to do it. And they have just endless rabbit holes that they can go down, which are completely incorrect and misguided and how do you fix that? I don't fucking know how you fix it. It's I am cautiously optimistic that in 50 to 100 years, this will be a resolved problem. Um, if it, the alternative is basically that we never fix it and civilization kind of implodes upon itself. I don't think our current situation, certainly the situation that we have where Republicans are completely anti-small d democratic. Um, it's one thing to be like for your party and against the other party. Not great, but I get that. But to be completely opposed to the fundamental concept of democracy to the point where you're very happily passing laws and installing judges who are going to make decisions that are going to inhibit democracy. That's not viable to continue that. Equally not viable is to have the other party, the other major party, sitting there looking at that situation and in a position where very briefly, for a period of like a couple years, you could go, okay, I see that in something like 48 states, Republican legislatures have put forward laws like this, or bills, I guess. And in a lot of them, they've actually passed laws that are extremely restrictive, that are, enhancing gerrymandering, that are voting, anti-democratic, small d democratic. I see that. I'm going to pass voting, broad, sweeping voting rights legislation now while I have the chance. You could say that. You could also say, hey, I understand that the Senate, even though the population is way, way, way aligned with, and when I say me, I don't mean just the Democratic Party, but I mean with me personally, the population is on my side here. And on many, many issues. Now, maybe there are some things where we disagree, but healthcare, just, the environment, all kinds of things, pretty much there. But the Senate, because of the structure of our country, is largely going to be dominated by Republicans. The House is, biased that way. Certainly much more so than the population. And many of the states are. So it is just, like, even without restrictive laws preventing people from voting and fucking with the vote, even without that, Republicans are more likely to take over shit. You add that stuff in, and then the Democrats are sitting there like, it'll be fine. We'll just out-organize them. Sure, they're going to gerrymander us into oblivion, and they're putting things forward where like certifying elections becomes a completely political thing, which is a really great plan. Stuff like this. We'll just out-organize them. That's it. We'll do. Don't worry about it. We're not gonna pass voting rights legislation. Fuck that shit. Why would you do that? We're just gonna sit there and I got to tell you, first off, out-organizing. Now, I feel like the people who are talking about this shit have never done this shit, because I've gone out and both for myself when I ran for office and for other people, Bernie, Green New Deal, even Hillary. I went out. I still, and I don't regret it, but I went out after Bernie lost in 2016. And from sort of mid-August through and including election day, about once a week, I went out, knocked on doors in Arizona, where it's fucking hot as hell. It's 40 degrees now, and this is cool for Arizona in pre-August times. I'm out there. Now, granted, I went out in the morning before it was like the peak of the day, but you're sweating your balls off. Trust me. I'm out there. I'm knocking. I'm talking to people. I'm encouraging people to vote. And first off, you're seeing. I encourage you, if you've never done that, pandemic notwithstanding, I do encourage people to do it, because you get a picture of the electorate, of people that you probably don't have. If you've not done it, you don't understand. A lot of people have a lot of weird ideas. It's first off, obviously haven't taken civics. I feel like I've done first off like 12 times now, but they haven't taken civics, or if they've taken civics, they have a distorted view of how elections work, of how democracy works. Very many people are, a shockingly large number of people are like, voting doesn't work, it doesn't matter. It's really, and I guess there are two ways to do this. One, if you go and you're campaigning for a popular Democrat and they have the VAN, the Voter Access Network list, usually they cut the turf, so you're talking to people who are pretty consistent, reliable voters. That's a different population than if you're just randomly going to either all houses in an area or people who are less likely to be voters. When I went out for Hillary, they had the likely voters generally covered, so I was going to a lot of people who were less likely voters or not consistent voters, trying to get extra people out. And that was it was an eye-opening, enlightening experience, because you'd talk to people and you would get the impression that they've never talked to anyone for a candidate. If they have talked to someone, somebody comes by in their neighborhoods, and I was going to a lot of sort of poor, lower socioeconomic status neighborhoods, and it's just so obvious that the Democrats came in, talked to people for the election, try to get the vote, and then basically just fuck off for 4 years. Never mind the midterms, probably not even going to bother with it, but definitely we're not going to do anything for you. And then they come back 4 years later and they're like, hey, vote for us again. Who are you going to, you're going to vote for the other guys who are even worse? And you can understand why people get a little bit jaded when that's what they're talking to. So trying to convince people to vote for Hillary under those circumstances was very fucking difficult. I talked to people who, believed and I'm not a fan of Hillary's. Certainly, like younger Hillary, maybe more so. Although, knowing now what I didn't know when Bill was president, less of a fan of both of them by far than I was then. But more of a fan of them when they're younger, especially her, than her today. She has become wildly cynical, and not necessarily, like, you understand where it comes from. It's not like, oh, just out of the blue she became cynical. Yeah, you look at the shit that the Republicans did to prevent her from doing anything, or from, ironically, from healthcare reform in the 90s, just demonizing her, going in and doing all this Benghazi bullshit, and endless hearings over her, and just all this shit. And it's been effective. Like, people believe just Looney Tunes shit about this woman. But, I'm not a fan of hers. But the stuff that people believe about her is just out of the fucking world insane, like detached from reality. You get the liar thing. Very easy. People believe, and it depends on who you're talking to. I talked to people who are Trump supporters who literally believe that she has had, and for some reason the number here seems to be very significant, 50 people whacked. It's a weird number to pick, but they're very set on that number. She's had outright murdered people. And it's not like they're thinking this may have happened. They're certain of it. It's like, yeah, of course, matter of fact, yeah. People talk about shit that's just like, where the fuck do you get these ideas? And how does this get through your bullshit filter? Like, you should have a bullshit filter that this stuff gets into and then goes, no, come on. The example I always go back to, and I'm sorry, Gil has probably heard this 1,000 times. Probably you have if you've listened to very many of these, because I talk about it all the time. It's out of date now, of course, but the Obama "you didn't build that" speech. At the time, I was on Facebook still. Very glad not to be there anymore, but I was on Facebook, and I had friends who were Republicans. And one of them shared this thing about the "you didn't build that" speech. And she was like, So I see it, and you're like, this doesn't sound right. The quote, the headline is basically like, if you had a small business, you didn't build that. You look at that, and then the first response you should have is, that doesn't seem right. Now, that doesn't seem right doesn't mean it's not right, but it does mean, okay, I'm going to Google it, find the actual quote, find the context, and see what is actually there, because the pieces don't quite fit together. That's how you should think, right? You Google it. It took me 30 seconds tops to fucking Google it, find the original quote, read the quote in context, and then it's like, oh, well, if you have a small business, you used a lot of public goods, streets, infrastructure, all this kind of stuff that you did not build. And that was what he was saying. And you look at that and you're like, well, of course, and that makes sense. Even if he, I mean, there's the thing, he's a fucking successful politician. Even if he believed you didn't build your small business, which would be insane to say, or insane to think, even if he did, he's not going to say that. So think about it for a second. Look at the quote, and then you're like, oh, yeah, he didn't say you didn't build your small business. He said you didn't build all the things that made your small business work, or your not so small business, Jeff. So this kind of shit is annoying. Like, the bullshit detector thing does not exist. The counter that I always use to that is, and I think this is an important thing to, just, I saw people talking about Romney putting his dog on his car and driving for something like 8 hours. And the same thing, you see that and you should go, that doesn't sound right. You do some research and you're like, okay, again, doesn't sound right doesn't mean it's not right. But it means, bullshit detector, pinging a little bit. Do some research, you look it up, you read about it, and you find out, in that case, he actually did do it. He actually drove with his dog in a crate over his car for something like 8 hours. So, the bullshit detector is not a lie detector. It is just sort of an element that you should have in your brain, well-tuned, to determine, is this something that I'm going to believe or not? And it doesn't mean that you're believing it or not based on the bullshit detector. The bullshit detector is just a screening mechanism. That's literally all it is. It doesn't actually have any correlation. Like, things that do not trigger your bullshit detector, and even probably shouldn't trigger your bullshit detector, sometimes things are reasonable and they're not true. They're things that are like, that seems consistent. Doesn't mean that you should just believe everything. It's very important as well. But also, like, if something is consistent with like 99 things that you add one thing to it, you're like, okay, I'm not going to investigate it necessarily. Seems plausible on first brush. I'm just going to file it away. But don't accept it automatically. Just kind of sort of go like, okay, if I want to make a claim about this, then I should look it up. Otherwise, I'm just going to kind of file it away as, probably true, but based on cursory investigation. But then there are things that trigger the bullshit detector, and the Romney thing happens to be true. The Obama thing happens to be false. These are things that should work. The Republicans now seem almost anti-parsimonious. And it's not just the Republicans. I really try to be careful not to pick specifically on them. Not because there's an equality between liberals and Republicans, the sort of like bulk of the Democratic Party and the Republicans. They're very different people. But they do share some things in common. And this lack of bullshit detector, the lack of expertise, and the belief in things that is disconnected from reality, it's very common today, independent of politics. And that's not to say that the Republicans don't believe a lot of things that are crazier and more wrong, certainly true. But like the anti-vaxxing thing, it's pretty, the one that I hear all the time that seems to be almost universal now. When I say almost universal, I don't mean like everybody believes it, but kind of across socioeconomic status, across demographics, across politics, I hear lots of people saying, I'm not an anti-vaxxer. You got to have the suspenders and your thumbs in there. I'm not an anti-vaxxer, but obviously is a really big red flag. And then they come up with some bullshit about, well, I'm going to stagger my vaccinations for my kids because I know better than the CDC and the WHO and the NIH and all the people that make those recommendations. Of course, the CDC right now is not doing themselves any favors because they've just recently added recommendations. Not like you have to do this. It's not like a command, but like, we should probably, if you're going back to school, you should probably mask up. Very soft recommendations. These are not like mandates. They're not saying like, oh, if you go to school, you have to, which they should fucking be doing. It should be like, if you're a teacher, you have to get vaccinated. You have to wear a fucking mask. You have to, respect basic aseptic technique and not try to get your students killed or try to get your grandparents or whoever they're going to be in contact with killed because you're spreading fucking virus in a pandemic. That's not, it shouldn't be this is the thing that's maddening to me here, because this should not be a political thing. It should just be a rational, objective fucking thing. And then you get talking to people, and people have these ideas like, well, what if somebody asked if, vaccines should be mandated? And this was also on Twitter. You notice a theme here. I'm talking about how bad it is to react to stuff on Twitter and not to come up with stuff de novo, and everything I'm talking about is just something in response to something somebody said on Twitter. But they said, should we have a vaccine mandate? And my response to this is abso-fucking-lutely. Certainly not like we're going to have armed or like police or somebody come to you and like force jab you. No, but you should have, like, if you want to participate in society, you don't want to be masked, or even if right now, I'm of the opinion everybody should be wearing a fucking mask. We'll talk about that later, but everybody should be wearing a mask. But if you want to like engage in society and not be like shunned, and you don't have a reason not to be able to get vaccinated, you should be vaccinated. The reasons not to be vaccinated, incidentally, and this was this is what I'm trying to come up with here. They're very few and far between. Like, there are legitimate medical reasons why you can't be vaccinated. Most of the people that use these do not have the issues, which is not to say that people don't have these things. If you are immune compromised, being vaccinated probably, depending on what the nature of your compromise is, you might not be able to be vaccinated. If you're on immune suppressants, then you're artificially immune compromised. If you are someone who has certain kinds of allergic reactions, and that's not to say everybody that has allergies should not be vaccinated, but certain people, a very limited subset with very certain things, maybe the adjuvants in the vaccines will cause a hyper reaction, and then kind of dangerous, so you probably don't do it. But those are all exceptions, and they're very small in number. They're not really that prevalent, and for the most part, the people that have those exceptions are people who probably shouldn't necessarily be going out and participating in society anyway. If you're immune compromised, you're probably wise to stay some distance from people and wear a mask and kind of avoid getting sick, not just because of this current pandemic, but because you're fucking immune compromised. So this excuse that people want to use is like, well, what if somebody doesn't have, first off, you don't have that situation. Just 99% of the time when somebody says this, they don't. It's just bullshit. So drop that shit unless you have a legitimate medical reason. And if you do have a legitimate medical reason, then saying, well, why shouldn't people who can't do this get... The problem is, if you have those issues, you probably shouldn't be just going out, especially during a fucking pandemic, exposing yourself to stuff that could fucking kill you because you don't have an adequate immune response, which means A, you can't get vaccinated, or you can be, but it's not going to generate an effective immune response, a protective immunity. And B, you'll go out there and you could get sick from whatever. So I don't know, it's annoying just to go off on this. And again, this is with people have their own random takes about shit, and it's just like, oh, I think this, so I've thought about this for 30 seconds, and I went to Google U, and I went to the fucking YouTube channel where some asshole bald white guy was talking in just ranting and rambling for an hour. But anyway, never mind that part. But you know what I'm trying to say here. Like there's some situations where you just like your take is not it's not valid. It's not something. It's not even that it's invalid. It's just like it's ungrounded from anything that should mean anything or something that it's like shooting off your opinion about shit that you don't even have any business shooting off an opinion about. It's annoying. The mask thing, so I mentioned at the beginning of this, vaccinated people can have very high viral loads and be shedding virus, which can get people sick. And right now, especially with the Delta variant and probably other, new and better variants coming out, you can be vaccinated. And even if you imagine that you are completely protected, you can shed the shit. You can get infected, shed the shit, and then get other people sick. And when other people get sick, they can die. And why take the fucking chance? This is why I've been, I'm not a huge fan of masks. I don't like them. It's not, and I'm not doing it because I'm in fear. I feel like I'm probably pretty okay, honestly, not based on anything, but, not too concerned about it. But I would rather not kill somebody inadvertently by getting an asymptomatic infection and spreading shit to somebody needlessly. So I still wear a fucking mask. And also, I mean, the mask that you're wearing probably, unless you're wearing something with very small pore size, probably not really protecting you anyway. So this whole idea that you're wearing a mask out of fear is just fucking insane and ludicrous. But you're probably, the reason to wear a mask after being vaccinated is to keep other people protected. Especially other people who are working in a restaurant, for example, and they're exposed to a bunch of assholes who think it's a good idea to go to a restaurant and not wear a mask in the middle of a pandemic. Another thing, I mean, the CDC thing, I'm really disappointed by the CDC director and just a lot of people who've been doing public health, NIH, all of this kind of stuff. These things are not that complicated. What kind of information are you giving people? Giving people simple, consistent information that is not confusing is really part of science communication. It's part of why these things exist. And understanding what that information is going to do when a random person hears it, how they're going to process it, what their response is going to be, is not a complicated thing. I mean, like to some extent maybe, but this is not like figuring out 20 moves forward and go. It's like figuring out tic-tac-toe. You could probably figure it out. You don't have to be a grandmaster of chess or better to be able to see what's going to happen here. The situation that we find ourselves in, and that we did a few months ago when the CDC said, fuck it, if you've been vaccinated, you don't need to wear a mask. How fucking stupid, honestly, do you have to be to look at the situation that we live in right now and not realize that what that means is that the people, because there's no way to verify that somebody has been vaccinated. There's no easy, like, I've been vaccinated, I got the thumbs up. So you're basically relying on the honor system. And the people who are not getting vaccinated have no fucking honor. So they're just sitting there like, fuck it, I haven't been vaccinated, I'm not gonna wear a mask, I'm just gonna go out and do whatever I want because, fuck everybody else, and I have my freedom to swing my fists, and who gives a fuck whose face I hit while I'm swinging it. And incidentally, I can't, if you can't get it from the tone, fuck these people so much. So as soon as they said that, it fucked things up, because now you've got people who are vaccinated not wearing masks because they're well-intentioned, but they don't realize, I could still be, spreading this shit. Even if I'm completely protected personally, I'm still putting other people at risk. You have, and also I'm getting challenged by new virus that's constantly mutating. And you have this situation where there's always some stuff going on never gets stamped down to the point where you can actually go out unmasked. It's always in the environment, always mutating, and you're getting exposed to it. It's just a recipe for selecting for, you know, virus that can evade your immune response. It's just like if you wanted to design the experiment to create the selective pressure to evolve that kind of virus, this is how you do it. Having, you know, India and big chunks of Africa basically unvaccinated, not having, you know, stuff contained at all, that's great. You have a reservoir for the shit where it can mutate and spread, and then it comes out, and you know, we're a very connected world. So even with slight travel restrictions that we have, you know, stuff leaks out. It's not, yeah, I mean, look at Taiwan. Taiwan has done a very good job of this. Somehow still some stuff leaks in. You know, which is probably assholes doing stupid shit, but it happens with a large enough population. So the best you can do is try to restrict that as much as possible. And, you know, for the CDC, explain shit and do it consistently and concisely, and don't look like you're, well, we don't know the details of this and that. Yeah, I mean, this is the thing that gets me about this. Because the CDC guidance where they told people to take the fucking masks off was stupid, even not knowing that the Delta variant was going to, you know, be a huge problem for people who are vaccinated too. It was stupid because obviously it opened the floodgates, got people not wearing masks, and now you're trying to get people to do something that they kind of didn't want to do anyway. They have this weird political shame, like this was a ridiculous thing that I read, I think today, but people are getting vaccinated but wearing disguises because they don't want their friends and family to know that they're getting vaccinated in a pandemic. You know, fucking great society we've built here. So anyway, I mean, just that the CDC didn't know this was going to happen is bizarre. That the fucking Biden administration thought it was a good idea to go like, hey, yeah, doctor. I'm putting air quotes around Dr. Biden's doctor, not because, you know, I'm a doctor too, but being a doctor and like a PhD, and then you talk in a medical context, like if I go like, I'm Dr. Scott and I'm going to tell you about that. If I'm sitting here doing that, I am a doctor. I have a PhD in physics, biophysics, emphasis, and I do have all the stuff for a PhD in terms of coursework for microbiology, immunology, virology, that kind of stuff. But I'm still not a medical doctor. Not that medical doctors know that much. I mean, this is a thing that causes me great consternation as well. I mean, and with all respect to medical doctors, I trained when I was in graduate school. I did microbiology courses. A lot of doctors have only taken like introductory microbiology in a single microbiology lab, which I have taught, and it is not adequate for people doing this kind of stuff. And just the stupidity of, and part of it, yes, is ignorance. It's not just stupidity, but the amount that people don't understand about aseptic technique, people who are doing surgery and people who get a ton of respect, it's depressing as fuck. So I'm not trying to elevate medical doctors. I'm also not trying to disparage people with PhDs. I'm just trying to say, you are a doctor of education or something like this, or you're a medical doctor who has not done a lot of specialization and study in infectious disease or immunology or virology or whatever. Probably not your takes are probably not helpful. Yeah, I've talked about this. I have a friend, actually a guy who works for us, hopefully not revealing too much, but his wife is pregnant, and I can't even say this. Fucking OB-GYN told her not to get vaccinated. OB-GYN, which is a doctor, don't get vaccinated, yeah. In a fucking pandemic, pregnant, and, you know, obviously, like, I don't know if you know this, very low risk to get vaccinated. Getting COVID, bad enough, worse when you're pregnant. He, and a bunch of his fucking friends, all playing hockey, all got fucking infected with this because one of their other asshole friends happens to be a car salesman who is, of course, not vaccinated, not wearing a mask, car salesmen interacting with a ton of people, gets it, gets sick, goes to the fucking hockey game, spreads it to everybody, gets everybody else sick. They're sick for like 2 weeks and pretty fucking sick, like to the point where, you know, like it's kind of scary. It's like not life-threatening exactly, but, you know, really fucking sick. And you sit there and you look at this and you're like, what the fuck? And the whole time I just keep thinking about this fucking OB-GYN who made this terrible medical decision and gave horrible advice to somebody and certainly is not going to lose their license, certainly is not going to stop practicing, or and also certainly probably not going to change their fucking tune. I find this really reprehensible. It's terrible. So I certainly want to tell you, being an MD does not make you magically know that much about medicine. Being an MD, and I again don't mean this disparagingly, means you know enough about the body and sort of how things work to be able to be a good technician who can diagnose and treat things. And it really is like a very highly skilled auto mechanic, I would say. That's the better comparison. And certainly, unless they're specialized in infectious disease or immunology or virology or vaccinology, they're probably not going to know that much about this stuff. And certainly also, epidemiology is a whole field of study unto itself. I've taken a course in it, and I have like the barest scraping of the surface of that. There's a lot of stuff in there, and there's a lot of stuff in epidemiology that's not really intuitive. And this is without even just talking about things like unintuitive statistics. Like our brains are not really built to be fair, we didn't evolve for it, to look at statistics and then understand relative risks or understand like, okay, these are the circumstances, this is the best course of action. You have to really train yourself to do that. And even then you're not going to be right all the time, but you have to do that. You have to look at a lot of data. You have to, the stuff that you have to do is not natural. It's stuff that, takes some deep understanding. And then you get people who have no expertise in this stuff at all, not even any business talking about it. And they get into deep, philosophical conversations with people about shit they know nothing about. And they're just spreading babble and nonsense. And it annoys the fuck out of me. So anyway, I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, this is a thing that I feel actually like was an okay thread that kind of came slightly unbundled, but I think it's more or less bunched together. There's more that I could say about it as always, but I could also just keep going on forever and what am I going to say? The important thing and the point of all of that, if there is a point, is that not every take is worth being said, not worth being debated. This will be the last thing that I talk about, but just people feel like they can espouse their inane bullshit ideas that have no foundation in whatever. And they also feel like they have a right to be debated and to have these things discussed and not dismissed out of hand. And I mean, the thing is, when you're talking to experts and you're saying things that are just obviously wrong, the expert has the option of maybe trying to discuss with you and explain to you why you're so wrong. But this is not a thing where you're two peers talking back and forth and going, like, well, I think this and I think this. And you're kind of opening your minds and exchanging information and ideas freely. You're fucking wrong sometimes, and you're sitting there telling somebody who knows much better than you do about this subject, and you're expecting them to treat you on an equal ground. You spend some fucking years actually doing real study, get ratcheted up to that level, and then start talking, and then we can talk. Now that's not to say, again, and I always, the difficulty here is, of course, there is the danger of an appeal to authority. And I want to be very clear, I'm not trying to make an appeal to authority when I say this. I am not in any way saying, just because you've got a PhD in something, you know everything about it and you're always right and infallible. Ideally, in fact, if you have a PhD in something, you should be more willing to identify problems with your beliefs, problems with your thoughts and understandings of that subject. You should be more willing to see that stuff and more able to see that stuff when somebody points it out than a random person. People are not always perfect at that, but that is the ideal. And hopefully, I think it's not that far from reality for a lot of people. The person who's sitting there, espousing this bullshit, watching the long rambling YouTube videos and, sitting there like citing stuff that has nothing to do with anything, this person does not deserve, and I'm not saying it's like, like, oh, you haven't earned it, but you haven't earned the right to have a debate like this. And again, not because of authority, but because this person knows so much more than you and is operating on a very different level. It's like you understand calculus and differential geometry and manifolds and tensor bundles and things like this. And somebody has like the barest scraping of algebra and they're trying to tell you something. You can try to talk and have a conversation and understand things together, but you're probably, unless it's something where you happen to be a savant and you're talking about the Hairy Ball theorem and you like, maybe you have some special insight there. It happens, it's possible, but probably not. Probably fucking not. So you have to balance this properly. And I don't have a good understanding yet of how to do that. I worry that there's no great way to do it. I worry greatly that there's no kind of, I don't know how you would say this exactly, but sort of observer independent test for whether you're, like a bullshit detector, but not just one that works for other things, but one that you could construct and anyone could use the same bullshit detector. My bullshit detector going to go off on different times than yours. Now, obviously, expertise and experience are going to influence that. But the thing that's really important there is that my bullshit detector should go off about things that I am invested in just as much as things that I'm not. And yours should as well. If yours doesn't, and I think this is the best that I've been able to come up with on this, is that the difference is that if you have a good bullshit detector, and if it is relatively observer independent, then if the bullshit detector is like shown onto your stuff and there's something wrong with it, you will find that and you will correct it. And we all are going to be wrong about certain things. So if you don't ever have that, if you don't have the experience where you're like, oh shit, I'm wrong, I'm going to change, I'm going to improve, I'm going to get better, that's a red flag. If you have the experience where it's like, it's kind of mysterious that I'm always right about everything and I'm never wrong and I never learn anything, that's a red fucking flag. If you don't have that, if you don't have this thing where you're just kind of going like, oh, it's not a good thing. What you need is the ability to see these things in yourself. And it's not to say that you're not, like, it doesn't have to happen all the time. It doesn't even have to happen that often. But you certainly need to have something where somebody points out, this seems wrong. And you don't just dismiss it out of hand unless you've already done the math and the work and looked into it. Then you can kind of cache it and be like, I've already looked into that. I've already verified it. There's no new information here. I'm okay. But if somebody points something out, you have to do some diligence there. Check it out. Make sure you understand it. Get like what the question is. See if if there's any truth to it. And then if you are right, cache it. Comes up again and you're like, I've already looked into that. We're pretty good, unless there's new information. But if you're wrong, then you go like, oh shit, I was wrong. And hopefully you actually think of that as a good thing. I'm going to get better. I'm going to learn something. I'm going to correct my mistakes. And then you go forward. And that's where we should all be. This is another problem with takes, because takes don't have this self-correcting mechanism. People have takes and they're just like, oh, this is how I feel, and it's just, it's just how I feel, and it's independent of, it's just good, and it's beautiful. I shat in my hands, and then it's just beautiful in there, and that's fine. It's like, no, not every fucking take is good. And just because you had the take does not mean you should just assume like your take is equally valid to everybody else's. Even if you're agreeing, and this is the part that, to just bunch this up and wrap finally, the guy that I'm talking about that spurned all of this off was agreeing with me. It's like, that's my take. Yeah, it's your take. It's great that it's your take. But the fact that you're agreeing with me does not diminish the fact that, your take is just a take. It's not like an informed opinion based on actual evidence. It's just your take. And that is what I'm trying to get to. So the whole point of all of this was just to talk about something where somebody agreed with something that I said and get really consternated about it. So that made sense. With that, thank you very much, as always. I will certainly do this again next week, but in the meantime, have a good time. Wear your fucking mask. Don't be an asshole. Don't be like overly paranoid, but be fucking respectful of other people. And say Jen.